The Vikings often evoke romantic images of bold warriors sailing to far-off lands, feasting in longhouses, and living free of modern worries. In popular culture, we imagine hardy Norsemen and shield maidens in a simpler, idyllic rural life. But if you were magically transported to a Viking Age farmstead, the reality would be anything but romantic. Daily life, for the vast majority of Viking Age people, was harsh, demanding, and perilous. Almost everyone lived on small subsistence farms, not in grand halls of constant revelry. From sunrise to sunset, survival meant ceaseless labor, plowing fields by hand, tending animals, grinding grain, chopping wood, weaving cloth, and preparing food with the simplest of tools. Men, women, and even children toiled to produce everything the household needed. This was no quaint rustic lifestyle. It was a fight to wring enough food from the land to last the long, brutal winters. Modern conveniences, electricity, running water, grocery stores, medicine, heated homes did not exist. In their place were back-breaking chores, primitive technology, and constant threats from nature. The work was divided by gender, but no one had it easy. Women labored from inside the smoky longhouse to the milking sheds, while men strained in the fields and forests. Tasks that we might finish in minutes with power tools or appliances could take hours or days of strenuous effort. A simple loaf of bread required grinding grain by hand, kneading dough, and baking in a hearth. A pair of trousers meant shearing sheep, spinning yarn, weaving cloth, and stitching by firelight. Injuries were common and could be devastating without proper medical care. Food could spoil or run out, especially after a bad harvest or during a bitter winter. Comfort, safety, and leisure were rare luxuries on a Viking farm. Throughout this exploration, we'll walk through a day in the life on a Viking Age farm, hour by hour and season by season, revealing the grueling drudgery and hazards that awaited at every turn. We'll see how farm work varied between men's and women's roles, what kinds of food and shelter the farm family had, and what dangers lurked in their world. The facts will be drawn from historical and archaeological research, which paint a vivid picture of ordinary Norse life over 1,000 years ago. By the end, it should be clear why a 21st century visitor, used to modern comforts and healthcare, would barely survive a single day on a Viking farm without immense struggle. So, settle in by the hearth, mind the smoke, and prepare for a long, detailed journey told in a calm, gentle tone through the reality of Viking Age farm life. It's a story that may be fascinating enough to keep you reading, yet tranquil and steady enough in its telling to serve as a bedtime chronicle. Let's begin our trip back in time. The isolated Scandinavian farmstead. To understand the hardship, we first need to picture the setting. Viking Age, Scandinavia, roughly 8th–11th centuries, was overwhelmingly rural and sparsely populated. Instead of bustling towns or cities, there were vast stretches of wilderness, forests, fjords, mountains, and icy coasts, with small pockets of human habitation. The typical community was a farmstead or a tiny village. Even the largest Viking-era villages held only 15 to 50 farmsteads, household farms, clustered together. Many settlements were much smaller, just a handful of farms, or completely isolated single farms in remote valleys and islands. Only about 1–2% of the population lived in actual towns, which were mostly small trading ports. For everyone else, home was a solitary farm or a hamlet where the nearest neighbors might be a long walk or ride away. Imagine a lone farmstead nestled in a cold northern valley. It consists of a longhouse, the main dwelling, and perhaps a few outbuildings like a shed or barn, all surrounded by a patchwork of fields and pastures. Forests loom beyond the cleared land, and maybe a fjord or lake lies in the distance. There are no roads as we know them, just dirt tracks or footpaths connecting farms. Travel is slow, often on foot or by horse. In winter, deep snow or frozen lakes might isolate the farm completely for weeks. The farm's inhabitants mostly see only each other for long stretches of time. Loneliness and self-reliance are fundamental parts of life. If trouble strikes an injury, a failed crop, a storm damage, there is no easy way to summon help or buy supplies. The nearest market or blacksmith might be days away. A graveyard likely sits on the edge of the property, a quiet reminder of the ancestors who worked this same earth. Those ancestors are literally rooted in the land as burial mounds or gravestones, symbolizing the family's claim to the farm and its continuity across generations. The climate adds another layer of challenge. Scandinavia's weather can be harsh and unpredictable. In the Viking Age, the region experienced cold winters with snow and ice, especially in Norway, Sweden, and the higher latitudes, and short, mild summers. The growing season for crops was brief. If spring came late or autumn early, there was little time to sow and harvest. In the far north, summer days were long sun, barely setting in midsummer, but the sun's warmth was weak. In winter, daylight might last only a few hours, or in the Arctic Circle, the sun would not rise at all for weeks. On the farm, surviving winter meant preparing diligently during the rest of the year. Every summer day had to count, making hay, growing grain, and gathering food while the weather allowed. Winter brought biting cold, when streams froze and snow piled high against the longhouse walls. The isolation intensified in those dark months. Travel was dangerous or impossible, and the family had to subsist on whatever food and fuel they had stored. Despite these challenges, Viking Age people managed to build homesteads that made the most of their environment. The longhouse was the center of life and refuge against the elements. Let's step inside one. Figure: a reconstructed Viking longhouse stands on a Scandinavian hillside. These long, turf-roofed houses sheltered large extended families, and often their livestock, through the harsh winters. Inside the Viking longhouse was a long, rectangular building with curved walls that sometimes made it resemble an upside-down boat in shape. Most were built of whatever materials were available locally. In forested areas, thick wooden planks or logs made up the walls. In treeless areas like parts of Iceland or Greenland, blocks of turf, grass sod, might be used instead of wood. The roof was steeply pitched to shed rain and snow, and it was supported by rows of posts along the interior. Thatch, straw, turf, or wooden shingles covered the roof. Notably, these homes had no chimneys and often no windows. Instead, a central hearth, fire pit, ran in the middle of the hall, and the smoke from cooking and heating simply vented through a hole in the roof or seeped out the thatch. This meant the air inside was usually smoky, especially in winter when the fire burned constantly. The walls might be daubed with clay to block drafts, but smoke was a fact of life, leaving a haze in the rafters. Living in a longhouse likely meant coughing, and smarting eyes were common, and lungs suffered from the constant smoke inhalation over the years. A typical longhouse could be quite large in length, anywhere from 15 to 75 meters, 50 to 250 feet long, though only about 5 to 7 meters wide, 16 to 23 feet. This long, narrow hall was multi-purpose. There was no separate kitchen, bedroom, or barn as we might have today. Instead, the space was divided for various uses. One end of the longhouse was reserved for animals, especially during winter. Cattle, sheep, goats, maybe a few pigs or chickens would be brought inside to a small stable area at one end of the hall. Keeping animals indoors helped them survive the winter cold and had the side benefit of their body heat warming the living space, albeit slightly. Of course, it also meant the occupants lived alongside the smells and sounds of a barn, the mooing of cows, bleating of goats, the shuffling of hooves at night, and the pungent aroma of manure. Privacy and cleanliness, as we define them today, were simply not attainable in such conditions. The opposite end of the longhouse might be used for storage or as a workshop space. Viking farms were largely self-sufficient, so the household needed to craft and repair many of their own tools and goods. There might be a corner with a simple forge for ironworking on a small scale, mending a broken knife or tool, or a woodworking area with an axe and shaving bench to shape wood. If the family was involved in any specialized craft like leatherworking or textile production beyond household needs, that end of the hall is where it happened. Clutter filled any available space. Sacks of grain, bins for root vegetables, hanging bundles of dried herbs or fish, stored farming tools, and the family's stores of food for winter crowded the interior. Whatever valuables or equipment they had, it had to be kept safe from weather and thieves, so it stayed inside. The central area of the longhouse was the living and sleeping space. Along each long wall, built-in wooden benches ran the length of the hall. These benches had multiple functions. They provided seating by day, serving as both chairs and work surfaces, and at night, they became the family's sleeping platforms. The benches might be heaped with straw or hay for cushioning, and covered with furs or wool blankets for warmth. Pillows, if used, could be simple sacks stuffed with feathers or down. It's believed that most people slept in a semi-upright seated position, propped against the wall, rather than lying flat, possibly because the benches were narrow or due to the smoky air that accumulated more heavily near the roof. A seated sleeping posture might have made breathing easier in the smoke-filled hall. Imagine drifting off to sleep with your back against a timber wall, the faint glow of embers in the hearth pit, and your nose acclimated to the mix of wood smoke, sweat, and livestock odors permeating the darkness. At the center, the hearth fire was literally and figuratively the heart of the home. This long fire pit provided heat, light, and a place to cook. By day, a cooking tripod or iron cauldron might hang over the flames, simmering the day's meal. By night, the fire was kept burning low for warmth. There were no modern lamps, but the Vikings did craft simple oil lamps, small dishes of carved stone or metal that burned fish oil or animal fat as fuel. These could offer a flicker of extra light, but any indoor activity after dark was faintly lit at best. One can imagine the orange glow of firelight dancing on the wooden beams, the silhouettes of people moving in the dim hall, and deep shadows in the corners where the fire's light couldn't reach. Despite the darkness and smoke, the longhouse was home. It sheltered an extended family, not just parents and children, but possibly grandparents, aunts, uncles, or cousins perhaps, 20 to 30 people in one household for a larger farm. In a way, The plenty, crowding brought some comfort in an unforgiving world. People slept close together, sharing body heat under heavy wool blankets. Multiple generations lived under one roof, so children grew up amidst the constant presence of family. Community was literally in arm's reach, and for all the hardships, there was likely a sense of security in closing the door on a winter night, knowing that everyone and everything, kin, animals, food stores was gathered safely inside the stout wooden walls. The howling wind outside might seep a little cold through the plank walls, but the collective warmth of people and animals, plus the crackling fire, created a small bubble of life in the frozen darkness. Now that we have imagined the surroundings, a rugged, remote farmstead with a smoky, crowded longhouse, let's look at what the people on this farm actually did from dawn to dusk. How was work divided, and what tasks filled their endless days? To survive on a Viking farm, every member of the household had roles and responsibilities, finely tuned by necessity. Division of labor, men's work and women's work. On a Viking Age farm, everyone worked. The idea of leisure time barely existed, except perhaps in the depths of winter or brief festival days. Tasks were generally divided by gender, reflecting a practical split between outside work and inside work. However, this division was not absolute. There were times when all hands, regardless of gender or age, had to pitch in together, especially during critical seasons like harvest. The survival of the household depended on a cooperative effort. Let's break down the typical responsibilities. Men's work, outside the household. Men were primarily responsible for agricultural labor and other outdoor tasks. This included preparing and tending the fields, plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting crops, and managing any heavy labor like chopping wood, building structures, or tending large livestock in the pasture. Men also often handled hunting and fishing if those were part of the farm's food supply, as well as any traveling or trading that needed to be done, for example, taking surplus to market or retrieving goods from town. In addition, men bore the duties of defense and warfare, though not an everyday chore. The expectation in Viking society was that able-bodied men might be called to fight or go on raids, trading expeditions during certain times, leaving the women and older family members to maintain the farm in their absence. On the farm, however, the day-to-day grind for men was agricultural, fertilizing fields with manure, guiding the plow or ard drawn by oxen, cutting hay, threshing grain, and maintaining the farm's structures and fences. Men also crafted and repaired tools when necessary, especially woodworking for handles, carts, or building new barns and sheds. Women's work, inside the household. Women's domain was traditionally within the threshold of the house, but that phrase can be misleading. Women's work often took them outdoors as well. The primary evasion tasks of women were producing food and clothing for the household. This encompassed a vast array of skills. Food preparation meant not only daily cooking, making porridges, stews, baking bread, but also processing and preserving foods for long-term storage. Women milked the cows, goats, or sheep, and then turned that milk into butter and cheese as quickly as possible. Fresh milk spoils without refrigeration, so they made dairy products that could last. They brewed ale or other fermented drinks when supplies allowed, and made vinegar or sour whey drinks for daily consumption. They were in charge of the hearth, managing the fire from morning till night for cooking and heating. Producing clothing was an equally monumental category of work. Women spun wool from the farm's sheep into thread, dyed it using natural dyes, wove the thread into cloth on upright looms, and then cut and sewed garments for the family. From bedding to sails, if it involved textiles, it was women's responsibility. Additionally, women took care of the young children. Though on a farm, even children soon had chores of their own. They washed clothing, likely in a nearby stream or tub, did laundry when weather permitted, and maintained whatever cleanliness was possible in the household. They also managed the storage of food, keeping track of grain in the bins, rationing flour, monitoring the smoked meats or dried fish, and making sure the household had enough to survive until the next harvest. In a sense, women were the household managers, ensuring that the output of the farm, the milk, grain, wool, etc., was transformed into usable products and that nothing went to waste. This gendered division of labor was not strictly enforced by some rigid rule, but rather it evolved because it was practical. Viking society valued both men's and women's contributions. In fact, women often had a great deal of authority within the household. They were sometimes called the husfru house, mistress, or freeholder, especially if the man of the house was away or had died. Women in charge managed the entire farm in such cases. Sagas and historical sources indicate that a capable farm wife was respected for running a tight ship, overseeing the thralls, slaves or servants, planning the work, and even handling the family's finances or keys to the storerooms. Men, on the other hand, had societal duties, like attending the local thing, assembly, or defending the honor and interests of the family in legal matters, which women could not usually do. Thus, each gender had its sphere, but they were complementary. Children, too, had roles from a young age. By the time a child was 5 or 6, they would start helping in small ways. Girls learning from their mothers to card wool or knead dough. Boys trailing their fathers to the field to fetch water or scare birds from the crops. Given the high infant and child mortality rates, families who wanted to ensure some children survived into adulthood often had many offspring, which meant there were usually a few youngsters scampering about, each being trained to take on work as soon as they were capable. A 10 or 2-year-old Viking boy might be ploughing with an ox, and a girl of the same age might be milking cows or spinning wool. Childhood was short, and pragmatic children were expected to contribute and carry out the work of an adult early in life. In a world where life expectancy was perhaps 40 years on average, one couldn't afford a lengthy adolescence. Still, no matter how well divided the labor, the key feature of Viking farm work is how labor-intensive and physically exhausting it was for everyone. Let's delve deeper into the specific tasks and why they were so demanding. This will illustrate what a modern person would struggle with if dropped into this environment. We'll start with the core of the farm, growing food in the fields. Working the land, farming tasks and challenges. Agriculture was the foundation of life on a Viking Age farm. If the crops failed, the household might starve. If they prospered, the family could eat, trade, and survive another year. However, farming without modern machinery meant that even the simplest fieldwork required tremendous muscle power and persistence. A Viking farm produced a variety of crops, most importantly grains. The common grains in Scandinavia were barley, rye, and oats, which are hardy in cool climates. Barley was often the staple for making bread and porridge, as well as ale when possible. Rye could make dense bread and stored well. Oats were used for porridge and animal fodder. Wheat was a luxury grain that did not grow well in the north, except in some southern regions or in special conditions. So most everyday bread was not the fluffy wheat loaves we might imagine, but rather heavy barley or rye flatbreads. Beyond grain, farmers grew vegetables and legumes, cabbages, onions, garlic, beans, peas, turnips. Carrots could be cultivated in kitchen gardens. They also harvested wild foods like berries, nuts, and herbs when in season. But the grain harvest was paramount, as it provided the calories to make it through winter. Now, consider how these fields were worked. Ploughing was the first major task in spring, and arguably one of the hardest physically. In the Viking Age, the plough available was typically a wooden ard, also known as a scratch plough. Unlike modern ploughs, which have metal ploughshares that cut and turn over soil, the ard was basically a pointed stick or wedge, sometimes tipped with iron, but often just wood, that ripped a groove in the earth without turning it fully. This meant the soil wasn't well aerated or weeded by the plough. To compensate, fields were often cross-ploughed, ploughing once, then ploughing a second time at a right angle to the first furrows to break up the clods from another direction. Imagine dragging a heavy wooden plough through rough soil with only oxen or human slaves for power. The ard could break or wear down quickly, being made of wood. It wore out every couple of days and had to be repaired or replaced. This added an extra layer of toil. Farmers had to carve new plough parts or keep spares on hand, which meant more woodworking on top of farming. If oxen were available, a pair of oxen would be hitched to the yard to pull it. Training and managing oxen, castrated bulls, was itself a skill. These animals are strong, but not as responsive as a modern tractor, and they needed food and care year-round. Not every farm could afford to keep oxen just for ploughing. Some poorer farmers had to rely on human strength. In fact, slaves, thralls, often provided the brute force for the most grueling chores, including pulling the plough themselves when animals were not available. It's almost unthinkable from a modern perspective. People harnessed like beasts of burden, straining to drag the plough through heavy soil under the spring sun. For the slave or unlucky farmer doing this, it would be back-breaking work, hour after hour, slowly scratching lines in a field that might be rocky or root-ridden. Once the fields were ploughed, twice over, in cross-hatched fashion, it was time for sowing. Without machines, sowing seed was done by hand. The sower carried a sack of grain seed and cast it across the ploughed ground in broad, even sweeps, trying to distribute it as uniformly as possible. This might sound idyllic, casting seeds to the wind, but it is tiring to walk up and down acres of soft soil, your feet sinking, all day long swinging your arm in a heavy arc, and the work had only begun. After sowing, someone might lightly harrow or rake the soil to cover the seeds. Weeding would need to follow in the coming weeks. Likely women, children, or any available hands would periodically squat and pull weeds from the fields. There were no herbicides to spray. Crop maintenance also involved fertilizing. Viking farmers understood that soil could be enriched by manure and by letting fields lie fallow. They practiced crop rotation, leaving some fields unplanted each year to regain fertility, and spread animal dung, and even human dung, on fields as fertilizer. Collecting and spreading manure is a messy, smelly job, even today with tractors and spreaders. Doing it by hand, with shovels and baskets, was an unpleasant but necessary chore, often left to slaves or the younger laborers. One can easily imagine a modern person's stomach turning at the task, trudging through mucky barnyards, shoveling piles of dung onto a handcart, then flinging and raking the manure across the soil. Yet, without these nutrients returned to the earth, the next year's crop yield would drop, so it had to be done. Through spring and early summer, the fields would be watched carefully. The weather was always a worry. Too little rain and the crops would wither. Too much rain at the wrong time could rot them or knock them flat. A hailstorm could destroy a field in minutes, and a frost could kill seedlings overnight. These farmers had no control over nature's extremes, and no crop insurance or government aid. A bad year's weather could mean famine. We'll discuss this grim prospect later. They also had to guard against animals eating the crops. Fences or hedges might keep out some wildlife, but birds could swoop in to eat the seeds or grains. Children might be sent out with slings or noisemakers to scare off flocks of sparrows or crows that could decimate a field of barley. It was literally a struggle to protect every stalk of grain until it was ripe. By late summer, if all went well, the harvest arrived. Harvest time was an all-hands endeavor. All members of the household would typically join in the work, since it was so laborious that all available hands were needed, be they male or female. Cutting the grain had to be done quickly, at the right moment when the grain was dry and ripe. Men typically did the cutting with scythes or sickles, sweeping through the golden fields and slicing the stalks near the ground. This is heavy work. Swinging a scythe for hours uses every muscle in your arms, shoulders, and back. Meanwhile, women followed to gather and tie the stalks into sheaves, or they used rakes to collect the cut grain. The pace could be frantic if weather threatened. Imagine clouds rolling in and a farmer's panic that rain could ruin the drying grain. Everyone would race against time to get the harvest in. Older children would help bundle and carry sheaves. Even the elderly or very young might have roles, like bringing water to the workers or laying out stalks to dry. Once cut, the grain had to be threshed and winnowed. Threshing means beating the dried stalks to knock the grains loose from the seed heads. Viking men would thresh by hand, using wooden clubs or flails. They laid bundles on a hard surface and beat them until the grains fell out. This could be done inside a barn or on a threshing floor to keep the grain contained. It raised clouds of dust and chaff. In a time before dust masks, the thresher would choke on particles and end up with blisters on his hands from the constant striking. After threshing, the mixed pile of grains and chaff, husks, had to be winnowed, tossed in a basket or blanket, so that the breeze would carry away the lighter chaff and the heavier grain would fall back down. This step required a windy day or a strong person flapping a sheet. It was often women's work to winnow and pick out the debris, collecting the precious clean grain kernels. Now you had grain, but still not food. The next daily task, grinding. Grain is hard and not edible as is. It had to be ground into meal or flour. On a Viking farm, this usually meant using a hand mill or quernstone. A typical hand quern consisted of two circular stones. The bottom one was stationary, the top one had a hole for pouring grain in, and a handle to turn it. Women, often, would kneel and grind grain every day for the day's flour, by laboriously turning the upper stone against the lower. It might take an hour of grinding just to get enough flour for a single loaf or a pot of porridge. It is hard, repetitive work pushing a stone around and around, feeling the arms and shoulders burn. A lucky, wealthier farm might have had access to a watermill to grind grain. By late Viking Age, watermills were introduced in a few places. But this was rare. The The Norse farm woman typically armed herself with patience and muscle to grind grain by hand daily. Harvest also included haymaking for animal fodder. In fact, for farms with livestock, cutting and storing hay, dried grass, was a make-or-break task for surviving winter. Hayfields or wild meadows had to be mown in summer, usually after the grain harvest. Men scythed the long grass, and women and children followed to rake and turn it so it dried in the sun. The dried hay was then piled onto wagons or simply gathered and carried, sometimes using a large blanket or cloth, to the barn or a haystack near the farm. We should not underestimate haymaking. It could be as demanding as grain harvest. One had to cover every inch of available meadow, often in marshy or uneven ground, under the summer sun. The hay, once dry, was bulky and had to be transported, which might involve loading huge bundles onto a sled or cart and then unloading. Winter feed was vital. If you didn't have enough hay stored, your cows and sheep might starve before spring. In places like Iceland, it's recorded that over 2 tons of hay were needed to feed a single cow through the winter. A large farm in Viking Age Iceland might have 20 to 40 cattle, so they needed an enormous quantity of hay stored to keep those animals alive. Harvesting and gathering that volume by hand was an arduous task that consumed late summer. If a farmer guessed that his hay stores wouldn't suffice, he faced a grim choice: slaughter some livestock in the fall. We'll talk more about this in the seasonal section. For a modern person, the sheer scale of manual labor required cutting hectare upon hectare of grass with a scythe, raking it dry. Hauling ton after ton of hay to a barn would be staggering. Finally, we should mention other typical field tasks: pasture maintenance and fencing. Livestock often grazed in common pasture or in the wild during summer. In Norway, farmers would send animals to mountain pastures, called seta, with some family members to watch them. The farm needed sturdy fences or stone walls to keep animals out of the crops and to pen them in at night. Building and repairing fences was a continual chore: cutting poles, driving them into the ground, weaving wattle hurdles or stacking stones. Wood chopping for fence posts or for fuel was also endless. In the dense forests of Scandinavia, trees had to be felled with axes. An axe and human muscle were all they had. Chopping down even one large tree can take hours of swinging and can be extremely dangerous if done improperly. Yet wood was needed for building, repairing, and winter firewood. What's evident is that farming tasks were hugely time-consuming and physically taxing. From the first thaw of spring until the last leaves of autumn, there was always more work to do than there were hours in the day. A Viking farmer woke up before dawn and often collapsed into bed, exhausted after dark, with maybe a brief rest for meals. For a person today used to tractors, electric tools, and perhaps an 8-hour workday, joining a Viking farm's workforce would be a rude awakening indeed. The labor was perilous, grueling drudgery, as one historian aptly put it. Injuries could happen at any time: an axe slip, a kick from an ox, a fall from a wagon, or simply the accumulated wear on joints and bones from constant heavy work. Next, we'll shift perspective and look at the vital work women did, in parallel, much of it indoors, but no, less exhausting, and how the household managed daily food and clothing production. The heart of the home: women's daily chores and skills. While the men and older boys toiled in the fields, forests, and pastures, the women and older girls were equally busy with the domestic side of farm life. The survival of the family depended just as much on the women's productivity in the household as on the men's productivity in the field. Food didn't cook itself, clothes didn't appear by magic, and milk didn't turn into butter without effort. Let's walk through a typical array of women's chores on a Viking farm and the challenges each presented. 1. Food preparation and cooking. Every single day, without fail, the household needed to eat. On a Viking farm, there was no corner bakery or market to buy ready meals. Every morsel was prepared from scratch. A farm wife, often with help from daughters or other female relatives, had to plan and cook multiple meals a day for a large family and any workers, servants. The day might start with a simple breakfast of leftover porridge or bread and milk, but even that required preparation. Someone had to grind the grain and make that porridge the day before, or bake that bread early in the morning. Baking bread was a frequent task. Viking bread was usually flat and dense. Grain, barley or rye, was ground into coarse flour by hand, then mixed with water or whey to make dough. The dough might include a bit of sourdough starter or yeast from brewing to help it rise slightly, but these were heavy loaves or flatbreads, often cooked on a flat stone or iron griddle over the fire. Baking could be a daily or every few days job because bread didn't have preservatives and would go hard or moldy quickly in the damp northern climate. Just imagine waking up and before anything else, spending an hour turning a quernstone to grind flour, then kneading tough dough for another while, all before the rest of the family has breakfast. It's labor before the day's main labor. A mainstay of the diet was pottage or stew. This was essentially a thick soup into which whatever was available went. Grains, vegetables, maybe some dried fish, or a bit of meat, all boiled together in a cauldron over the fire. Because large roasted meat joints, think of a spit-roasted animal, were for special feasts, not everyday fare. A daily Viking meal for common folks would more likely be this kind of porridge. Stew. It was filling and could be stretched to feed many. The woman of the house would maintain this pot, adding water, barley, turnips, herbs, etc., letting it simmer. There was skill in flavoring it with salt precious and not locally available in inland farms, unless they burned seaweed or traded for salt and herbs. She had to ensure there was enough for everyone. If guests arrived unexpectedly, a common occurrence in a society that valued hospitality, she had to make the stew go further. There were no clocks, but one's stomach and the position of the sun dictated meal times, and the cook had better be ready. Dairy processing was another daily chore. When animals were in milk, milking cows, goats, or sheep had to be done twice a day, morning and evening, without fail. Women typically did the milking. Picture dawn at a farm, a woman stepping out into the brisk air, perhaps with frost on the ground, carrying a wooden pail. She approaches the small pen where the cows are kept overnight and squats by a cow's side. If she's lucky, the cow is cooperative. If not, a swat of the tail or a sudden kick could knock her over or spill the milk. Milking by hand takes time. Each cow might take several minutes to empty, and on a farm with a dozen cows, that adds up. The fresh, warm milk then needs immediate attention. Without refrigeration, milk spoils quickly, so Viking Age people converted milk to longer-lasting forms: butter, cheese, or fermented milk. Churning butter was a frequent task. The cream from milk, let to rise, then skimmed, would be churned in a tall wooden churn by pumping or turning a dasher for perhaps an hour or more, until butter formed. It's tiring to churn that long, a repetitive arm workout. Meanwhile, the buttermilk left over might be drunk fresh or saved for baking. As for cheese, they would allow milk to sour and curdle, or add rennet from a calf's stomach to make curds, then press it into cheese. Fresh cheeses and curds would last a little longer than milk, and harder aged cheeses could last much longer, but required cool storage. They also made skyr in Iceland, a yogurt-like cultured milk, and a drink called syra, which was basically the sour whey left from cheese making, often slightly fermented. In fact, the average person on a farm might drink syra, sour, whey daily, because brewing ale or mead was expensive and reserved for special occasions. Syra was nutritious and safer than water. Sometimes fermentation can kill some harmful microbes. So, part of a woman's daily work was to manage these dairy products, store the milk, decide what becomes butter or cheese today, make the butter, cheese, hang it, or salt it to preserve, etc. It's a continuous production line in the summer when animals give milk. In winter, cows give much less or are dry if they weren't fed well. So winter was a lean time for dairy, meaning the preserved summer cheeses might be what you survive on for calcium and protein in the cold months. Cooking also meant preservation. Unlike us, who have refrigerators and freezers, Vikings had to rely on smoking, drying, salting, or fermenting to preserve food. Women oversaw most of these processes. They would salt or smoke meat and fish. In preparation for winter, salt was valuable and often imported, so smoking and drying were more common. If the farm slaughtered animals in autumn, the women would be in charge of converting that fresh meat into hams, smoked sausages, or dried strips. They might hang meat high in the rafters above the hearth, so the rising smoke would cure it, also hopefully keeping it out of reach of dogs and pests. They dried fish on racks in the wind or over gentle smoke, producing stockfish or smoked fish. They pickled some foods in whey or ale, for example. Some Viking cultures may have pickled fish in sour whey or fermented barley in water to make a kind of soured grain dish. The root cellar or storage pit was the woman's domain, keeping stored vegetables like turnips, carrots, and cabbages in cool, damp sand or soil so they lasted months, and checking on them periodically for rot. Given all this, think of the time management involved. A Viking farm woman had to juggle multiple tasks simultaneously. She might knead dough in the early morning, then rush to milk the cow, then come back to shape loaves and mind the fire, then churn butter while the bread bakes, then check on a simmering stew, and that's just by late morning. Afternoons could be spent in other vital labors, like textile work, which we will discuss next. 2. Textile production, spinning, weaving, sewing, clothing a family in the Viking Age was a monumental task. There were no stores to buy new outfits each season. Every garment from undertunics to cloaks had to be made by hand, starting from raw materials like wool or flax. Wool was the most common textile fiber because sheep thrived in Scandinavia. On a farm, the sheep would be shorn, usually in late spring or early summer. The men might do the shearing, or women could as well. It's heavy work to hold a sheep and cut its fleece. Once the wool was off the sheep, women processed it, cleaning and sorting it, combing or carding it to align fibers, then spinning it into yarn. Spinning was done with a drop spindle, a simple weighted stick that you twirl to twist fibers into thread. A skilled spinner could produce a fine, strong yarn, but it took many hours to spin enough for even one garment. It was common for women to spin whenever they had a spare moment, while watching children, in between stirring the pot, or by the evening fire. In fact, artifacts like spindle whorls, the weights for spindles, are frequently found in archaeological digs of Norse settlements, highlighting how ubiquitous this activity was. Once there was enough yarn, the next step was weaving. Viking women used warp-weighted looms, a type of upright loom where threads, the warp, hang down and are kept taut by weights, often stone or clay weights tied at the bottom of bundles of threads. Weaving on such a loom is a slow process. The weaver stands and passes horizontal threads, weaved, through the warp threads, creating cloth inch by inch. A piece of fabric for a tunic could take days or weeks to weave, depending on the size and fineness. If the family wanted patterned or colored cloth, the wool had to be dyed before weaving. Natural dyes were used, requiring another set of skills, gathering plants, barks, or lichens, and boiling the wool with these substances to impart colors. Vikings enjoyed colorful clothing when they could get it. Contrary to the drab brown we often imagine, they had reds, blues, yellows, and greens from various natural sources. So a woman might one day be tending a dye pot with urine, often used as a mordant or source of ammonia for dyeing. The next day, weaving some newly dyed yarn into a patterned trim. After weaving, sewing the cloth into garments was needed. This was done by hand, with needles made of bone or metal, and thread that might be the same hand-spun wool or linen, if available for finer sewing. Every member of the family needed clothes, tunics, trousers, dresses, cloaks, hats, mittens, many layers for winter warmth. Children constantly grew out of things or wore them out, requiring new garments or patches. A woman had to be adept at mending as well, extending the life of clothing by patching holes or reusing fabric from worn-out clothes to make smaller items like children's clothes or quilted blankets. Beyond clothing, textiles were used for sacks, blankets, sailcloth, if they had a ship or boat, and more. Sailcloth, in particular, was heavy canvas-like woolen cloth, and providing a sail for a ship was one of the grandest textile projects. Some estimates suggest it could take the wool of hundreds of sheep and months of work to make a single sail. While not every farm made sails, this gives perspective on the vast amount of time women spent in fiber arts. Textile production was likely the single most time-consuming craft for women on a farm, often occupying them in the winter months when farming outside was minimal. For a modern person, something as simple as making a shirt would become an epic project if you had to start from raw wool. It might go something like shear sheep, wash and card wool, hours of work, spin wool into yarn over many days, set up a loom and weave cloth which takes weeks, then cut and sew the cloth by hand. In the time it takes us to order a shirt online and have it delivered next day, a Viking woman might only have spun a few bobbins of thread. The patience, skill, and sheer perseverance required are mind-boggling to us today. 3. Managing the household. Beyond producing food and clothes, women were effectively the household managers. They kept track of supplies, from how much grain was left in the bin to how many candles or lamp oils were on hand. They had to plan for winter. How much flour do we need to last till next harvest? How many tubs of butter or cheese should we store? Can we trade some wool for fish or salt? These decisions could make the difference between scarcity and sufficiency in the lean months. The keys of the household in sagas are often symbolic of a woman's authority. She literally held the keys to the food chests and storerooms, controlling access to resources. Also, childcare fell mostly to women. On a farm, a mother might carry an infant with her in a sling while she milks a cow or stirs a pot. As the children grew, she taught them the necessary skills, a daughter how to spin or weave, by giving her small tasks, a son how to tend animals. Additionally, care for the sick or elderly in the household was usually a woman's task. With no doctors available, the farm folk relied on traditional knowledge of herbs and remedies. A mother or grandmother might be the one to poultice a wound with honey, brew a healing herb tea for a fever, or comfort a coughing child through the night. This kind of domestic medicine was crucial because injury and illness were common. We will explore health soon. Women likely had a store of medicinal plants they grew or gathered. Yarrow for cuts, willow bark for pain, contains salicylic acid, like aspirin, garlic or onion as antiseptics, etc. They weren't formally trained, but survival made them pragmatic healers. 4. Miscellaneous tasks. Let's not forget daily cleaning, sweeping the dirt floor, shaking out bedding, though cleanliness had limits with animals inside and sooty walls. Laundering clothes, a tough job, before soap, was common. They used lye soap or just thorough rinsing and beating, maybe a communal wash on stream banks, and making household items like pottery or baskets if needed, though some items might be acquired through trade. Many farm wives might know how to weave a simple basket or mold a clay pot for cooking. In Norse graves, combs are a frequent find. This hints that keeping hair groomed and combing out lice was an ongoing chore. Everyone likely had lice or fleas given the living conditions, and women probably combed children's hair and deloused bedding as best they could with herbs or smoke. Cleanliness was relative. They did bathe when possible. There are accounts that Vikings bathed at least weekly on Saturdays, which impressed or startled some other Europeans of the time, who bathed less, and they enjoyed sauna-like steam baths where they could. But on a daily basis, living in a farm longhouse, dirt and grime were constant. Ash from the hearth would coat surfaces, and stray bits of straw, chaff, and wool would litter the floor. A woman might sprinkle water and herbs on the floor and sweep to keep dust down. Lamps burning fish oil could leave a fishy smell. It was a never-ending battle to maintain a semblance of order and comfort in the home. To summarize the women's daily workload, it encompassed cooking all meals, often one-pot dishes, plus bread baking, dairy, milking, and turning milk into butter, cheese, whey drinks, preserving food, smoking, drying, fermenting, pickling as needed, textiles, spinning wool, weaving cloth, sewing and mending clothes, household management, cleaning, organizing, childcare, nursing, and managing stores, crafts, possibly making soap from animal fat and ash, candles from tallow, simple remedies, etc. It is clear that a Viking farm wife would hardly have a moment free from dawn until night, especially when the household was large. Perhaps the only respite was in the evenings when, after supper, people sat by the fire. Yet even then, women's hands often stayed busy spinning or mending by firelight, as family members told stories or recounted the day's events. For a modern person stepping into her shoes, the constant multitasking and physical effort would be overwhelming. Just baking a loaf of bread in that era is a multi-hour affair. Now add caring for children and elderly, managing a fire that constantly needs tending, no thermostat to set, and producing everything from soap to socks by hand. It's safe to say many of us would be utterly exhausted and likely make critical mistakes, burn the bread, spoil the milk, etc., that could cost the family food they badly need. The Viking farm woman's skill set was incredibly broad and refined, from years of practice, a competence born from necessity, but one that would put any modern multitasker to the test. A day in the life, sunrise to sunset on the farm. Let us now weave together those tasks into the fabric of a typical day on a Viking Age farm, perhaps in the middle of the farming season. While every farm and season differed, we can imagine a scenario to illustrate how ceaseless the routine was. Dawn. The longhouse is dark, but for the faint grey light of early morning seeping through the roof vent. The fire in the hearth has died down to embers overnight. The first to stir might be the farm wife or one of the older daughters. She rises from the bench bed, unwraps herself from a wool cloak, and shivers in the chill. There is no clock to snooze, just an internal sense of urgency, and perhaps a rooster crowing or cow lowing to be milked. She moves across the packed earth floor, careful not to step on sleeping bodies. Children sprawled here and there, maybe a grandmother bundled in the corner. She stokes the fire first, stirring the coals and adding kindling and dry wood. Getting the fire going is priority. Without it, there's no light, no warmth, no breakfast. Soon, faint crackles and a growing glow indicate success, and smoke begins to curl upward. If the smoke hole had been covered due to rain, she adjusts it. A bit of cough from the smoke, but she's used to it. Next, she may put a pot of gruel or porridge on the fire, perhaps oats or barley in water or whey, started last night to soak. This will be the morning meal for the family. A simple porridge, maybe sweetened with a little honey if they're lucky, or flavoured with some dried berries. She might also slice some of yesterday's bread, if any is left. This morning routine is done quietly, with others slowly waking. The husband or farm master gets up when light grows stronger. If it's summer, dawn comes early, and there's much to do. If it's winter, dawn is late, and there might be a little more sleep, but also much snow to clear and animals to tend in the dark. We will consider summer first. Morning chores. As soon as there's enough light to see outside, the farm comes alive with activity. The men and boys head out to feed and water the livestock. If it's summer, the animals have likely been penned close to the house at night. Now they need to be taken to pasture. Someone guides the cows out to the field or ties a rope around the leading cow's neck to bring them to a grazing area. Sheep and goats are let out of their fold and driven toward the hills or commons where they graze, perhaps under the watch of one of the children or a servant who will keep an eye out for predator. If the farm has pigs, they might be loose to forage in the woods for roots and acorns during the day. The women, meanwhile, take milking pails and milk the cows or goats that are kept for dairy. This might be done before sending them to pasture, or sometimes in the evening when they return, or both. Today, let's say morning milking is done. The rhythmic squirt of milk into wooden buckets is accompanied by the cow occasionally swishing its tail at flies. It's a peaceful enough task on a fine morning, but the woman's hands might ache from the repetitive squeezing, especially if she's older or has many animals to milk. While milking and feeding happen, someone, perhaps a younger member, heads to a well or stream to fetch water needed for the day's cooking and drinking. They carry yokes with buckets, careful not to spill too much. If they're by a stream, the water is icy cold. No plumbing means every drop of water used in the household must be physically carried in. This alone could take multiple trips and considerable effort, a fact we seldom consider in modern life. Back at the hearth, with milk now fresh and warm, the farm wife strains it and sets some aside for immediate use. Perhaps this morning they'll have warm milk with their porridge. She also might skim cream from last night's milk that had settled, pouring it into a small churn for butter later. Breakfast is ready. Bowls of hot porridge are handed out. To each person, maybe with a bit of goat milk or sour whey on top. It's not luxurious, but it fills the belly. As they eat, plans for the day might be discussed briefly. Today, we must finish ploughing the west field, says the husband. The weather looks good. We should cut hay in the lower meadow before the rain comes tomorrow, says an elder son. The wife might chime in. The butter is low. I'll churn after breakfast. And the baby's cloak needs mending. I'll do that by midday. But usually, little is formally discussed. Everyone knows their general duties through the season's demands. After breakfast, late morning, the men head out to the fields for the main task of the day. Let's imagine it's early summer. The ploughing and sowing are done, and now haymaking is starting. Father and sons sharpen their scythes with whetstones and hike to the meadow. They will spend hours rhythmically swinging scythes through the tall grass, pausing occasionally to wipe sweat and sharpen the blade again. It is hard, monotonous work, but can be almost meditative. Swish, step, swish, step. The sound of grass whipping and falling. The sun climbs higher and warms the land. Birds sing in the trees. Despite the labor, there might be a moment of natural beauty. Dew sparkling on grass. The distant gleam of a fjord if near the coast. The scent of wildflowers mixing with the fresh-cut hay smell. Back at the farmyard, the women tackle their own long list. Churning butter is on the agenda. It's said that one can churn best in the cool of morning before flies become a nuisance. The wife pours cream into the upright churn. For the next half hour or more, she plunges the dasher up and down, up and down. It's tedious. Her arms tire, but she has done this countless times and keeps rhythm. As she churns, perhaps she recites a poem or hums a tune. Maybe a toddler clings to her skirt or plays on the floor with a wooden toy. Eventually, the sloshing sound changes. Butter granules have formed and clumped. She opens the churn and collects the pale butter, working it with cold, clean hands or a wooden paddle to press out remaining buttermilk. The butter is placed in a wooden tub. Some will be saved for the household, and some might be set aside to be traded or used to pay rents, taxes, if that system is in place. Butter was a common tax payment in medieval Scandinavia. The remaining buttermilk is tangy and will be given to the family to drink or used in baking. Next, she moves to cheese making. Last night's milk may have been left to sour or had rennet added. Now, it's clabbered into curds and whey. She cuts the curds and drains them in a cloth, perhaps hanging it to drip. This soft cheese might be eaten fresh or salted and stored. These processes overlap. While the curds drain, she might start another task. Perhaps today is also wash day. The weather is clear and warm, a good time to dry linens. So she and a daughter drag out. The laundry, mostly undergarments, linen shirts, woolen hose with holes, etc. They bring a tub or go to the brook. Soap as we know it is scarce. Sometimes they used lye soap, if they made some by saving ashes, and boiling with fat, or just scrubbed with water and a bit of urine, which contains ammonia, helpful for cleaning, especially wool. It sounds gross, but stale urine was indeed used in historical laundry. Let's say she has a bit of lye soap she made last winter, a harsh, caustic soap but effective on grease. Clothes are soaked, trodden or beaten against rocks, soaped and rinsed. It's backbreaking to haul and wring heavy, wet woolens. This might be a task done only occasionally due to its difficulty. Wool clothes don't need frequent washing, and undergarments can be aired out. In winter, hardly anything gets washed thoroughly. How to dry it in freezing weather. But summertime is when one would freshen things, so they do it now. The wet laundry is then spread on bushes or wooden frames to dry under the sun. Meanwhile, another woman, maybe an elderly grandmother, or a servant if the family has one, keeps an eye on the porridge pot or stew bubbling for midday meal. She might throw in some vegetables plucked from the garden earlier, a few baby carrots or turnips, leaves of nettle or spinach-like greens to add nourishment. Maybe they caught some fish from a net in a nearby river yesterday, so she flakes that into the pot. It might not smell gourmet, but it's hearty. Noon, midday break. The sun is high, and usually the workers in the field take a break around now. The men trudge back from haymaking for their dinner, what we'd call lunch. They're sweaty, bits of grass clinging to their trousers. Perhaps the wife or children have brought them food in the field on occasion. But today, the field is near enough to home that coming back is fine. They gather in the shade if possible, or inside the longhouse if the weather is too hot. Bowls of the day's main meal are served. It's likely that the biggest meal is at this time, to fuel the afternoon labor. A bowl of stew or pottage with bread is standard. Each person might also get a cup of ale or whey. Ale, if available, is usually home brewed, mildly alcoholic, and full of grains, almost like liquid bread. But brewing takes a lot of grain and time. Many poorer farms couldn't have ale all the time. Instead, a sour whey drink, the sira mentioned before, might be the daily beverage. It's full of protein from the milk and quenches thirst. For this imaginary day, let's say they have small beer, a weak ale, because they brewed a batch after harvest last year, and it's still lasting. They drink from horn or wooden cups. As they eat, there is some chatter, or maybe just weary silence, punctuated by slurps. The farm father might discuss how much was cut and how much more hay they need. The mother might mention that she noticed one cow looking a bit ill, or a stock of grain starting to mold. If so, that's worrisome. The midday break is short. Daylight must be used efficiently, especially in summer, when they have the gift of long hours. Afternoon. The men go back out, now perhaps to rake and turn the cut hay so it dries evenly, or to continue scything. It's repetitive, and one's back aches, but the work must go on. If they finish a portion, they might start gathering the dried hay into stacks or onto a cart. If a cart is used, an ox or horse pulls it, if the farm owns one. Loading the cart with hay by pitchfork, then unloading it in the barn, is heavy work. If they have older boys or extra hands, those might help with loading and unloading. A properly made haystack or filled barn loft will keep the hay dry for winter, an art in itself, to stack so rain runs off. On the women's side, by afternoon the laundry is drying, butter and cheese done, and now perhaps they can focus on textile work or other crafts. The wife might set herself up by the doorway where light and air are good and take up her spinning. Using a drop spindle, she twirls and draws out wool fibers into thread. It's quiet work, allowing her mind to wander or to chat with whoever is nearby. An older child might be at her feet, playing with the distaff, a stick holding unspun wool. Maybe she tells the child a simple story, or hums a lullaby as she spins. Spin, spin the spindle dances, and hums softly. The thread grows and is wound onto the rod. Alternatively, maybe today she needs to weave. In a corner of the longhouse stands the upright loom, weighted with several half-finished strips of fabric. Weaving requires standing and concentration. She passes the shuttle back and forth, thumping the weft into place with a beating sword, a flat wooden tool. It's tedious, but each pass adds a tiny bit more cloth that will eventually dress her family. If the household has slaves or servants, thralls, those individuals would also be working constantly. A thrall might be assigned the nastiest jobs, mucking out the byre, shoveling animal dung from the cow's area, and replacing dirty straw with fresh, collecting firewood, maybe a daily trip to gather dead branches, or chop timber, as fuel is always needed, or drawing water repeatedly. Thralls might also assist in farm work like planting or harvesting as extra labor. These enslaved people had minimal rights and were often captives from raids. Their life was even harsher in many ways, as they toiled under threat of punishment and without personal freedom. A modern person might find the existence of slavery on a Viking farm an additional shock morally and physically. To be suddenly placed as a thrall, forced to pull a plough or carry heavy loads on command, would be a nightmare scenario for someone used to modern notions of freedom and labor laws. Late afternoon, as the sun starts to dip toward the horizon, which in a northern summer might be late indeed, perhaps 4 or 5 p.m. before the angle softens, people begin wrapping up the day's major tasks. The men in the fields gather their tools and any hay or grain they need to bring in. Often, before heading back, they may check on the animals. They drive the cows and sheep back toward the homestead from pasture. In summer, sometimes, livestock were kept out at distant summer farms, sæter in Norwegian, with minimal supervision, and only brought closer to home in autumn. But let's assume these are near-field pastures. On their way back, they might stop by a forest edge to chop a bit of wood for tonight's fire, or collect any needed materials. The women take the mostly dried laundry off the bushes, now smelling of sun, and maybe still faintly of lye or smoke. It's folded and put away. They also check on the status of foods. Is the stew pot low? Did the bread supply last? Perhaps it's time to grind more flour for tomorrow's baking. A daughter takes up the handmill and begins grinding grain for an hour. She pours a little grain at a time, rotates the top stone. It's heavy and boring. A child might find it a chore indeed, but it was common for young girls to develop strong arms from the quern. Some sagas mention women with one arm much bigger than the other, from grinding grain daily. To make it less dull, maybe she sings, or a sibling helps turn the quern. Evening chores. As the men return with the animals, the farmyard becomes busy again. The cows are brought into their night enclosure, or even into the longhouse stable area for the night. This protects them from predators, bears, or wolves, could be a danger in some regions, and theft. And also, they'll be on hand for morning milking. Fresh bedding straw is laid if available. Sheep are penned or tied up nearby. The evening milking is done now, filling pails with the rich evening milk. Any that's not needed for immediate use goes to the dairy processing again. Tomorrow morning's butter, etc. The sun is low, painting the sky amber. After a grueling day, the farm folk are tired and hungry again. The main meal was midday, so supper might be lighter. Perhaps leftover stew, or bread and cheese, maybe some smoked fish. If the farm is fairly well off, they might have a treat like a bit of meat broth or a smoked leg of lamb to slice. Often, though, meat was not eaten daily by ordinary farming families. They relied more on dairy, grains, and occasional fish or preserved bits of meat. Let's say tonight they have some dried fish that's been soaking to soften. It's thrown into the soup to warm. They also have a knob of that freshly churned butter to spread on barley flatbread. The family gathers around the central hearth for supper. The long summer twilight means it's still light as they eat, which is helpful for morale. Nightfall. After supper, darkness gradually deepens inside the longhouse. They have no bright lamps, only the fire and a couple of oil lamps, or maybe a homemade candle, if they can afford one. Tallow candles made from animal fat were another chore. They sputtered and smelled, but gave some light. This is a time of minimal work, mostly quiet activities. Storytelling and socializing often took place in the evenings. A grandfather might regale the family with an old saga, or tell the children about their ancestors. Vikings had a rich oral storytelling culture. Even on a humble farm, they likely enjoyed poems, songs, or simply conversations recounting memories. It's a way to relax after the toil and also to pass down knowledge and culture. A weary farmhand might whittle a piece of wood into a spoon as he listens, or a mother might continue to mend a tear in a shirt by the flicker of firelight. But there were still tasks. The fire needed to be maintained so it wouldn't go out overnight. That would mean laborious relighting by flint in the morning, or begging an ember from a neighbor. So someone always tended it, banking it properly before bed. The animals inside needed some attention. A cow might need a cower, little water, or a calf, some milk. If a ewe was lambing or a cow calving, nights could be interrupted to help with animal births. On normal nights, though, once supper was done and a bit of talk was had, the family prepared for bed. They might say a prayer or invocation, depending on whether they were pagan or by late Viking Age, possibly Christian. They spread out bedding on the benches or floor. Typically, the pecking order might have the head of the family and wife on better spots, or separate bed closets. If they had built any, some longhouses had a few partitioned sleeping areas for the master's family, but many did not. Children curled up wherever there was space, perhaps sharing a big wool blanket. Slaves might sleep near the door, or even in the byre with the animals if space was limited. The air is warmer than outside thanks to the fire and the animals, but also stuffier. The smell of smoke has permeated everything. By now, the people themselves likely smell of smoke, sweat, and earth. They lie down in their clothes, changing into pajamas. Wasn't a thing one might remove a belt or outer garment, but most probably slept in a linen under tunic and some trousers or shift they wore all day. Through the night, the longhouse goes quiet, except for the soft sounds of people breathing, occasional coughs, smoke irritation, or maybe someone is slightly sick, and animals shuffling. There might be a symphony of snores from the older men. Now and then, a restless cow might low, or a baby might cry and need to be nursed. If rain starts drumming on the roof or wind howls, someone half awake might throw another log on the fire or check that the door is secured. But generally, everyone is out cold, just exhausted from the day. They need the rest, because tomorrow will be the same routine all over again. In winter, this daily pattern changed slightly because nights were long and days short. People slept more perhaps, or at least stayed indoors more. In winter, after the harvest was in and fields snow-covered, there was more time for crafts and repairs. Men might carve wood, make tools, or do blacksmithing for nails and axe heads if they had iron and a forge. Women would intensively spin and weave to clothe the family. It was also during winter that gatherings and feasts could happen. For example, Yule, the midwinter celebration, when work eased because nothing could grow outside. Paradoxically, winter was in some ways a time of relative rest from field labor, but it brought its own hardships: darkness, cold, and living off stored food with uncertainty if it would last. Many farms likely went a bit hungry by late winter if their stores ran low. People might lose weight and strength during winter months, a phenomenon known historically as spring hunger, when the winter's provisions near exhaustion just before new food comes in spring. We must also consider the emotional or mental toll of this life. For modern people, the monotony and isolation could be very difficult. On a remote farm, you see the same faces every day for months. The work is so constant that there's little time for creative outlets or relaxation as we know it. Entertainment was what you made yourself singing. Stories, perhaps board games like Hanafatafell, a Viking board game, in winter, or rare village gatherings for a market or a wedding. The Vikings did have some festivals and sports, like wrestling or skiing or archery competitions, when time allowed, often tied to seasonal events. But on most ordinary days, it's the grind. Now, having lived through this hypothetical day, albeit described gently, one might already feel overwhelmed. But we haven't yet touched explicitly on some of the worst parts of Viking farm life: the spectre of famine, disease, and violence that always loomed. These are the things that truly test whether one could survive not just physically, but existentially in that environment. We will now turn to those harsh realities that stood ever present in the lives of Viking farmers. Harsh realities: famine, disease, and danger. Up to this point, we have described the daily labor and conditions of Viking farm life. Arduous, certainly, but more or less the routine struggles. However, layered on top of those everyday efforts was the constant risk of calamities that could strike despite one's best efforts. Nature and fate were often cruel masters. A 21st century person might find the day-to-day labor exhausting, but what could truly break them would be confronting the kinds of crises that Viking Age people had to endure as a matter of course. The times when the crops failed, when illness swept through, or when violence erupted. Let's examine these harsh realities one by one. Famine and food shortages. Despite all the backbreaking farm work, sometimes the yields were not enough. Crop yields in the Viking Age were modest even in good years. Farming techniques were primitive, and the climate could be unforgiving. A single bad season, late frost, summer drought, or relentless rain could decimate the harvest. Because farms operated mostly at a subsistence level, producing just enough for the household with little surplus, there wasn't a big buffer for bad times. In modern society, if one region has a bad harvest, food can be shipped in from elsewhere, and governments or aid can intervene to prevent starvation. In the Viking Age, if your region's harvest failed, everyone around you was in the same boat, and there was no magic supply chain to bring relief. People would have to ration whatever they had, slaughter livestock, early sacrificing future assets for current food, forage for wild edibles, more extensively like acorns, bark, roots, or relocate if possible, which often it wasn't if the crisis was widespread. Historical and archaeological evidence indicates that famine was not rare. In fact, famine and hunger were ever-present dangers that could rob the farming household of their crops and, ultimately, their lives. There are documented instances in Nordic history of severe hunger. For example, medieval Iceland's sagas and chronicles mention famines where people survived on animal feed or starved. Earlier in the 6th century, pre-Viking Age, a global climatic event, possibly a volcanic winter in 536 AD, caused harvest failures and famine in Scandinavia, and some scholars speculate such stresses might have shaped later Norse society. While the Viking Age, circa 800 to 1050 AD, saw a slightly warmer climate period, the early medieval warm period, which may have aided agriculture, that did not eliminate the risk. Harvests could still be hit by blights or by swarms of pests, too. On a personal level, imagine a modern person who has never truly been hungry beyond missing a meal or two. Now they find themselves on a Viking farm where the bread has run out in March and the new grain won't be harvested until August. The dairy cows are producing just a trickle of milk because they themselves are underfed. The meat from the last pig slaughtered in autumn is long gone, or down to the last tough pieces. So meals get scantier, maybe just diluted porridge, or broth of boiled sheep bones for flavour. A Viking family might tighten their belts, eating perhaps one full meal a day instead of two, or mixing ground tree bark or nettles into flour to stretch it, practices recorded in later famines. Chronic undernutrition would set in. People would become weak and more susceptible to illness. Tragically, the most vulnerable in these times were the children. Infants might not get enough from a mother whose own diet was poor, so they failed to thrive. Older children might succumb to diseases because their immune systems were weakened by hunger. It's one reason the child mortality rate was shockingly high in Viking Age societies. An estimated 30–40% of children died before reaching adulthood. Some of that was disease, but famine and malnutrition were significant contributors. Modern people generally cannot fathom losing a third of all children to early death. It was a grim reality back then. Even beyond outright famine, seasonal hunger was part of life. A common concept in agrarian history is the hungry gap, the late winter and early spring period when stored food from last harvest is nearly exhausted and new crops aren't yet available. On a Viking farm, February, March, April could be lean months. Cabbages in the root cellar might have rotted, grain sacks nearly empty, and livestock too skinny to butcher or needed for milk, not meat. Many might endure a constant ache of hunger, a reduction in strength at the very time they need to plough fields for the next planting. Furthermore, natural disasters could cause sudden shortages. A flood could wash away haystacks or spoil stored grain. A wildfire or lightning could burn a barn. A summer hailstorm might flatten a field of barley in minutes, ruining it. A harsh winter might kill off livestock. Despite the hay stores, animals could freeze or get disease from the cold stress. Any such event could tip a family from subsistence into starvation territory quickly. Without any modern emergency services or aid, they were on their own to improvise or perish. For a modern person, experiencing famine conditions would be utterly terrifying. We take for granted that food is around us abundantly, and we've rarely, if ever, felt the true gnawing pain of prolonged hunger. The psychological stress of not being able to feed your children, of seeing everyone grow thinner and weaker, would be immense. Vikings had their deities and beliefs to perhaps give them solace or explanation. They might blame angry gods or trolls for crop failure, or see it as some might resort to desperate measures, stealing from neighbors, or abandoning infants. They couldn't feed infanticide in times of scarcity is sadly not unheard of historically. Thus, one reason you wouldn't survive a day might be extended to wouldn't survive a winter when famine hits, because it takes an ingrained toughness and experience to endure such hardship that we moderns simply haven't cultivated. And famine was a feature of life, often enough that it shaped population and health dramatically. Disease and health challenges. Even if you had enough to eat, the next big threat on a Viking farm was disease. In an era with no concept of germ theory, no antibiotics, and very limited medical knowledge, illness was often a death sentence, or at least a debilitating event. The tight quarters of the smoky longhouse, combined with poor sanitation and close contact with animals, created breeding grounds for many ailments. First, consider everyday health stressors. The work itself wore down the body. Skeletons from Viking Age graves show many individuals had arthritis in their joints, especially the back, hips, knees, and hands. It's no surprise, given the heavy lifting, bending, and manual labor from youth onward. A farmer might have chronic back pain and stiff knees by age 30. We've found evidence that many Vikings had bad teeth as well. More than a quarter had cavities, and many lost teeth by midlife. Without dental care or understanding of sugar's effect, honey was the only sugar and rare but gritty. Stone-ground bread could also wear teeth down, teeth decayed. An abscessed tooth could be agonizing and even life-threatening if infection spread. The smoke from indoor fires likely led to respiratory issues like chronic bronchitis or even early lung disease. Archaeological study of some Viking Age human remains shows thickening in sinus bones and indications that they inhaled a lot of smoke. Similar to how heavy indoor smoke inhalation affects people even today in some traditional communities. Pneumonia was a common killer. If someone got a bad cold or flu, there was a chance it could turn to pneumonia, and without antibiotics, many died from it. Wounds and injuries, which had to be common in farm work and occasional fighting, could easily become badly infected. A simple cut while chopping wood, if not kept clean, and how could it be clean in that environment, might fester. They knew some herbal remedies, and at times might cauterize wounds with fire or pack with honey, which actually can help due to antibacterial properties. But still, any deep wound was life-threatening. Tetanus from soil in a cut, sepsis from an infected injury. These lurked behind every accident. Parasites were another plague on health. Intestinal worms likely infected many people due to the fertilization with manure and lack of modern sanitation. Outhouses were rudimentary or non-existent. Often people used pits or the outdoors. Drinking water could be contaminated. We have found eggs of parasites in soil samples from Viking settlements. Chronic worm infestations can cause malnutrition and anemia, further weakening a person who might already be barely getting enough food. The presence of animals in close quarters also spread zoonotic diseases, diseases from animals to humans. For instance, drinking unpasteurized milk could spread brucellosis or tuberculosis if the cows had it. Cattle in enclosed spaces sometimes carry bovine tuberculosis, which can infect humans. It's possible some lung ailments were due to TB. Also, one study examining latrines in Viking Age Denmark found evidence of liver fluke parasites, likely from eating watercress or plants from fluke-infected waters, so they dealt with those subtler threats too. The living conditions guaranteed lice and fleas were ubiquitous. A Viking comb found in York had traces of lice between its teeth. Fleas would infest bedding and animals. These are irritating at best, constant itching, skin infections from scratching, and at worst, can transmit diseases, though the plague came just after the Viking Age, around 14th century Black Death. But earlier plagues, like the plague of Justinian in the 6th century, might have brushed Scandinavia. It's not clear. Even without epidemic plagues, lice can cause typhus, likely also later in history. But aside from major disease, just the discomfort and distraction of being vermin infested would drive a modern person crazy. Imagine trying to sleep while being bitten by fleas, or focusing on work while lice crawl on your scalp. Vikings made efforts to control them, for example, using combs, and perhaps herbs like bog myrtle in bedding as a repellent, but they never could eliminate them fully. Now, on top of endemic issues, there were acute illnesses, fevers, infections, childhood diseases, measles, smallpox, diphtheria, and other contagious illnesses, likely occasionally swept through communities. Infant mortality was extremely high, partly due to these infections. Even something as simple as diarrhea from a stomach bug could kill a child due to dehydration, since rehydration therapy wasn't known. Women faced the dangers of childbirth without modern obstetrics. Many women died in childbirth or from postpartum infections. A breech baby or prolonged labor could easily be fatal to both mother and child. There was no surgery possible except maybe a crude cesarean. If mother died, there's an Old Norse saga reference to a cesarean delivery, but it's legendary. If a disease swept the farm, they didn't really understand quarantine except maybe instinctively. Everyone might get sick at once. Who then feeds the animals or tends the fire? It could cascade into other disasters like loss of livestock because no one could care for them while ill. Medicine in Viking times was a mix of herbal lore and superstition. They had healers who knew some effective remedies, like certain plants as antiseptics or pain relievers, but they also invoked gods or charms. For example, a common treatment for illness might involve reciting a healing poem or binding a special rune-carved amulet on the patient. While these might boost morale, they didn't cure infections. A modern person, used to antibiotics for an infection or a dentist for a toothache, would find the Viking equivalents terribly insufficient. Archaeology provides a stark testament. Skeletons show significant disease, injury, and malnutrition. Many skeletal remains show signs of trauma that healed, meaning people survived broken bones or weapon wounds, but lived with the after effects. For instance, if someone broke a leg, there were no proper casts. It might heal crooked, leaving a limp for life. A slash from a sword or axe could leave a crippled limb or deep scar. Yet these folks soldiered on as best they could because they had no alternative. The strong impression from historical analysis is that the average Viking Age person was not the muscle-bound superhero of fiction, but often a weathered, scarred, and likely pain-riddled individual by modern health standards. As historian Anders Winroth pointed out, the usual image of the Vikings as able-bodied, strong, and healthily virile men has an important corrective in the skeletons surviving from actual Viking Age Scandinavians. In other words, the myth of the universally robust Viking is just that, a myth. Real Vikings often bore the marks of a life of hardship in their very bones. Thus, a modern person would not only struggle with the labor but might literally not survive common health challenges of that era. Even if you were strong, one infected cut or a bad winter cold turning to pneumonia could take you out. It took a combination of luck, genetics, and sheer toughness, and perhaps a strong immune system, honed by constant exposure, to live to middle age. The National Museum of Denmark notes that life was hard, and few Vikings reached beyond 50 years of age, with most dying in their 30 seconds, 40 seconds. Infant mortality and childhood disease drag that average down. Life expectancy at birth was around 20 to 30, but even those who made it to adulthood might only have a couple decades of relatively active life. By 50, if you got there, you were likely considered old and might be worn out physically. To put it starkly, on a Viking farm, death was a familiar visitor. Families experienced frequent loss of babies, children, sometimes a mother in childbirth, sometimes a father in an accident or a fight. They also lived intimately with death in terms of slaughtering animals, so they understood the cycle of life and death in a visceral way. A 21st century person might find that emotional environment extremely difficult. Death is not hidden away in hospitals or abstract. It's right in your home. The graveyard on the edge of the farm held relatives you remembered. You might step past it every day, reminded of how thin the line between life and death was. In sum, disease and health hazards would test a modern person's resilience sorely. Without our vaccines, medicines, and comfort, facing the raw onslaught of pre-modern ailments would be terrifying and likely lethal. Violence and raids. Finally, we must discuss the aspect of danger from other people, something a Viking farm was not immune to. We often think of Vikings as the raiders, but they themselves could be victims of violence too. Scandinavia in the Viking Age was not continuously at war internally, but it had its share of feuds, raids, and warband attacks. Raids were ever-present dangers that could steal not just your wealth, but your food and lives. On an isolated farm, one's main defense was perhaps a stout door and the hope that trouble bypassed you. There was no police or national army to call. If a band of armed men showed up, perhaps outlaw Vikings, a rival chieftain's men in a feud, or even slavers looking for thralls, your farm might be plundered or burned. In sagas, we read of farmsteads being burned down. In revenge killings, Njal's saga, for example, describes such an incident, albeit set in Iceland, a bit after the Viking Age proper. Also, coastal farms might occasionally face attacks from foreign raiders. It's possible, though less recorded, that Slavic or Baltic or even Irish raiders at times struck back, or pirates hit Scandinavian coasts. Even within regions, a powerful lord might demand tribute or taxes, effectively not much different from robbery if the demands were harsh. If warfare broke out between kings or local lords, peasants often suffered collateral damage. For instance, during the Norwegian civil wars, just after the Viking Age, farms were looted by opposing forces. In earlier Viking times, if a king raised a levy, farmers might be forced to go fight, or at least supply food, which could leave the farm short-handed or short-supplied. There is also the personal level of violence. Law and order in Viking societies was maintained by honor and the threat of feud. If someone wronged someone else, say a boundary dispute or insult, it could escalate to bloodshed, if not mediated at the thing. It wasn't daily life for most, but the possibility existed. Men carried weapons. Most free farmers had an axe, or sword, and a spear, so even a trip to the market could end in a brawl or deadly fight if tempers flared. The saga literature, although semi-legendary, is full of accounts of ordinary people getting caught in feuds and paying with their lives. Within the household, slaves had to fear punishment or violence if they disobeyed. Slaves sometimes revolted or ran away, which could also lead to violence. And Vikings practiced infanticide on occasion, especially if a child was deformed or if they couldn't support another mouth, which is a form of internal violence that a modern person would find horrific. Now, an actual raid scenario. Imagine at dusk, a handful of armed raiders appear at your farm fence. Perhaps your farm was rumored to have good harvest, or you have some silver from trading. The family might notice when the dog barks furiously, if they had a watchdog. There's little time to prepare. The men grab their axes or spears. Women huddle the children maybe towards the back or try to hide valuables. The raiders kick down the door or catch the men outside. A fight ensues. Brutal, short, and often one-sided. If the raiders are experienced fighters and the farmers are not, people could be killed or injured. The raiders might seize whatever is portable, any stored grain, livestock, stealing cattle or sheep, weapons, jewelry, and even people, especially young folks, to sell as slaves. This was not common everyday occurrence, but it did happen enough to be a fear. Archaeological evidence of some farmsteads show layers of burning coinciding with these times, indicating such burnings occurred. Psychologically, living with that threat meant having a mindset of vigilance and a certain fatalism. A modern person used to general peace might be traumatized by the violence or even just by the necessity to potentially kill or be killed to protect your farm. For Vikings, carrying weapons and possibly using them was part of life for the men. Women too could be victims of assault or carried off. One might say, but weren't Vikings strong warriors? Surely they'd defend themselves. Keep in mind, not every Viking was a warrior by profession. Most were farmers. They had weapons, yes, and could defend to a point, but a professional raider or warrior was something else. Also, numbers matter. A small family versus a war band stands little chance. Even outside of raids, daily work had its violent perils. A bull might gore someone, a horse might throw you, or a boar might attack. People also hunted. Sometimes a boar or bear hunt could be life-threatening. Drowning was a risk if you traveled by boat to trade or fish, and Vikings did boat even on inland rivers and lakes. Life was simply less secure in every dimension. Given all these factors, famine, disease, violence, survival on a Viking farm was a fragile state. People in that era developed coping mechanisms, a strong sense of community. Neighbors might help each other in crisis, when possible, belief in fate, so they could accept loss by attributing it to the will of the gods or Norns, and personal resilience. They had to be tough, both physically and mentally, starting from childhood. A child that survived into teens likely had weathered disease and learned hard work, and perhaps seen death up close, of siblings or others. They were by necessity hardened compared to us. From our standpoint, we might admire their fortitude, but would likely not want to trade places. This Old Norse life demanded an incredible degree of stoicism and endurance, yet it was normal to them. Now, to draw this to a conclusion, we can reflect on exactly why a modern person wouldn't last long in that world, and what differences highlight our reliance on modern systems. Through this reflection, we'll clearly see the vast gulf between our comfortable lives and the hard-scrabble existence of Viking Age farmers. Conclusion. a world apart from modern life. Having journeyed through the daily routine and struggles of a Viking Age farm, it is evident that nearly every aspect of that life stands in stark contrast to what we experience today. The Viking farmer's world was defined by physical toil, communal living, and an intimate acquaintance with hardship and death. In calm, measured words, we have described the labor of ploughing fields with a wooden ard, of churning butter by hand, of enduring winter's cold and summer's burdens. But make no mistake, beneath the gentle tone lies a reality that was brutal and unyielding. Why then wouldn't you survive a day on a Viking farm? Let's summarize the main points. Physical labor. From sunrise to sunset, you would be performing strenuous tasks that use muscle groups you perhaps never truly tested, carrying water, splitting logs, swinging scythes, kneading dense dough, lifting bales of hay, grinding grain by hand. The cumulative fatigue of just one day of these tasks, without modern tools or rest breaks, could leave an unaccustomed person utterly exhausted or even injured. And then you would have to get up and do it again, the next day, and the next. Viking farm work was perilous, grueling drudgery, requiring incredible inputs of labor to accomplish the simplest of tasks. Few modern people have the stamina or tolerance for discomfort that was common then. The average person today might find their back thrown out by carrying a heavy yoke of water, or their hands blistered and bleeding from an afternoon of scything or weaving without gloves. Basic comforts, or lack thereof. You would miss terribly the basic amenities of modern life. A soft bed, a hot shower, a toilet, clean clothes, and clean air to breathe. On the farm, you'd sleep on straw that might be damp or pest-ridden, likely never feeling truly clean. Bathing might be infrequent, maybe a dip in a cold stream or a heated tub on rare occasions, but certainly not daily. You'd relieve yourself in a simple pit or the woods, dealing with odors and no toilet paper, moss or leaves at best. The longhouse would be smoky, dim, and noisy with people and animals together. Privacy was non-existent. Personal space as we know it was a luxury they didn't have. Mentally, a modern person could quickly feel claustrophobic or irritated living in such tight community with no escape. Where would you go to be alone? Perhaps a walk in the woods, but then chores would be left undone. On top of that, the constant presence of smoke, flies, and smells of manure and sweat would assault senses unaccustomed to them. Nutrition and health. Even on a good day, the diet might feel very limited to you. Heavy barley bread, bland porridge, soured milk. Fresh fruits and greens were seasonal and scarce. Some berries in summer, wild greens in spring, but long winter months with none. Meat was occasional. You might find yourself both hungry and lacking the quick energy you're used to from sugar and snacks. Over time, you could develop deficiencies. For instance, vitamin C might be low, unless they brewed pine needle infusions or got some cloudberries, etc., risking scurvy in late winter. Dental hygiene was rudimentary. After chewing gritty bread and no toothbrushes, your teeth might ache in ways you've never felt. And if you fell ill or got injured, you would have to rely on hope and any traditional remedy. A modern person might panic without access to a doctor or even basic medication like pain relievers. Imagine enduring a severe toothache with nothing but perhaps clove oil or strong liquor, if even available, to numb it. Imagine a flu turning into pneumonia. You would be bedridden, coughing your lungs out on a straw mattress, while life has to go on around you. On a Viking farm, There was no real concept of sick leave. Others might cover your essential chores out of mercy, but your absence put everyone behind. In that scenario, you might indeed not survive beyond a day or two if the sickness was serious, because there's no intensive care coming, only maybe a healer with some herbs. Psychological strain. The Viking farm life was certainly full of natural beauty and strong family bonds, but it was also monotonous and mentally stressful. Modern lifestyles afford us mental stimulation, entertainment, education, and variety that a medieval farm simply couldn't. Many today would find it psychologically taxing to do the same chores day in and day out, with no wider news or fresh input beyond the small community. The scope of one's world was so limited, often just a few kilometers and the same group of people. For those used to the vast connected world of the internet and travel, this isolation could feel suffocating. Conversely, any sudden crisis, like a raid or famine, would bring acute stress and trauma that we are not used to coping with directly. We have safety nets. They mostly did not. That constant underlying anxiety. Will the weather destroy our crop? Will my child get sick? Are those distant shouts a raiding party coming? Could be overwhelming to a mind not raised to it. Harsh realities. Ultimately, the Viking farm was a place where life's fragility was on full display. Death and hardship were commonplace. About 1 in 3 or 1 in 2 children never made it to adulthood. Women faced possibly a 1 in 10 or so chance of dying each childbirth. Men could be maimed or killed by accidents or fights. Skeletons show they carried injuries and diseases. For us, such conditions might lead to despair or inability to function. For them, it was simply life. But to parachute a modern individual into that environment without lifelong conditioning would be almost cruel. It would be akin to stripping away all the buffers and protections we've ever known and exposing us raw to nature and fate. In reflecting on this, it's not to say Viking farm folk were miserable all the time. They had joys, a good harvest, a wedding feast, children's laughter, the beauty of the landscape, the comfort of faith and community. They could be happy and love their families just as we do. But the context of their happiness was very different. It was happiness despite hard conditions. As we imagine them sitting by the hearth at night, perhaps someone strums a lyre and sings an old song. Children doze off in a pile of furs, and for a moment everyone feels content. It's a serene image. Yet outside, the wind howls, and tomorrow, the grind begins anew at first light. For a 21st century visitor, one day on a Viking farm would likely leave you physically broken, emotionally shaken, and fervently wishing for a hot bath, a doctor, and a soft bed. You might survive the day if nothing catastrophic happened, but you'd be in pain and shock. Extend that to a week or a month, and chances are your health would falter, or you'd make a fatal mistake, like drinking unboiled water and getting dysentery, or faltering in the heat and slicing your leg with a sickle. The Vikings themselves recognized how tough their lives were. They didn't necessarily glorify the farming grind, which is why the sagas speak of feasts and heroics, perhaps as an escape in story from the daily norm. In conclusion, the romantic notion of going back to simpler times meets a cold dose of reality on the Viking farm. It was simpler only in the sense of technology, not in terms of ease or peace. In fact, it was a constant fight, a fight against the soil to yield crops, a fight against the seasons to preserve food, a fight against illness to stay alive, and occasionally a fight against other men to protect what little one had. A modern person, without lifelong training in this fight, would indeed find it nearly impossible to survive even a short time in that setting. We can admire the strength and resilience of our Viking forebears while acknowledging that we, cushioned by modern society, would be woefully unprepared to walk even a mile in their shoes, or rather, their handmade leather boots. Thus, the phrase, "you wouldn't survive a day on a Viking Age farm," is hardly an exaggeration. It serves to remind us how demanding life once was and how much we take for granted in our era. It also deepens our respect for those who lived through that age. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps glad for your comfortable bed, you might contemplate the countless unnamed Viking farmers, men and women, who labored in those northern lands. They lived rugged lives so fundamentally different from ours that it truly feels like a world apart. In understanding their struggles, we gain gratitude for the comforts we enjoy and a humbling perspective on human endurance in the face of adversity.